Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1883. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the buzz of late summer insects. On the open meadow where any sensible man would build, the ground was flat and the sun was generous. But Soren Lund was not in the meadow. He was in the shadows, wedged in a cool, dark gap between two colossal granite fins that jutted from the earth like the bones of a buried giant. His neighbors watched him from a distance. They saw him clearing brush not on a wide, promising plot, but in a gloomy slot canyon barely 20 feet across. He spent days with a plumb bob and a measuring line, not laying out a foundation in the soil, but taking the measure of the unyielding stone. Briscoe Tate, a master framer who had built half the cabins in the settlement, squinted from his own porch. "What in God's name is that Dane doing?" he asked Rufus Nye, the local wagon maker, who had stopped to watch the spectacle. "There's 100 acres of good land, and he picks the one spot you can't even turn a wagon around in." Rufus Nye, a practical man who understood the properties of wood and iron, shook his head. "He's measuring the rocks. Told me he plans to build between them. Use the stone for walls." Briscoe Tate let out a short, sharp laugh. "A rock coffin, then. The man's crazy. That granite will suck the heat out of his bones come January. It's a heat sink, plain and simple. He'll have ice on the inside of his walls. Mark my words." The sentiment spread through the small community like a grass fire. They called it Lund's Folly. They talked about the damp, the darkness, the risk of rockfall. They pitied his wife, Thyra, and their two small children, Axel and Freya, who would have to endure their father's foolish experiment. The mockery was patient and confident, born of hard-won experience in a land that did not suffer fools gladly. Everyone knew you built with logs, chinked them tight, and fed a big iron stove all winter. That was the way. Soren Lund, the quiet man from a land of ships and sea, was doing it all wrong. What did this quiet Danish shipwright understand about thermal mass and solar gain that the most experienced builders in the territory, men who had survived a dozen Dakota winters, had completely missed? Stick with me and hit that subscribe button. I promise that by the end of this story, you'll understand how a simple rock can outperform the most expensive iron stove, and how an entire community learned a lesson in humility from the one man they all dismissed as a fool. And do me a favor. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these old stories travel. Soren Lund was not a farmer, nor was he a frontiersman by trade. He was a shipwright, born and raised in a small port town on the coast of Denmark. His hands knew the language of wood, but it was the language of hulls and keels, of tight spaces designed to withstand the brutal, shifting pressures of the North Atlantic. He understood insulation not as a luxury, but as a condition of survival. He knew how different materials stored and released energy, how a wooden hull felt different from an iron one, how the sun on a black tarred deck was a force to be respected. He had brought his wife, Thyra, and their children, 8-year-old Axel and 6-year-old Freya, to America for the promise of land. But their first winter in the Black Hills, the winter of 1882, had been a brutal education. They had built a standard cabin, just as everyone else did. It was a simple box of felled pine, chinked with mud and moss, with a cast-iron stove in the center. It was a design proven by thousands of settlers across the frontier, and it was a thermal disaster. Soren remembered that winter with a cold knot in his stomach. He remembered the sight of his own breath fogging the air inside the cabin, even with the stove burning hot. He remembered the thin layer of ice that grew on the inside of the north wall, a crystalline tracery of failure that mocked his every effort. Thyra spent her days stuffing rags into the ever-opening gaps between the logs. The children, Axel and Freya, were never truly warm. They slept in coats, huddled together under a mountain of quilts. The floor was so cold that playing on it was impossible. Water left in a bucket just 10 feet from the roaring stove would develop a skin of ice overnight. The problem wasn't the stove. It was a good, solid stove that consumed wood with terrifying efficiency. The problem was the cabin itself. It was a sieve. Soren, with his shipwright's mind, saw the physics of the failure with painful clarity. He watched the heat they made with such effort bleed away into the frozen landscape through a dozen different mechanisms. The frontier cabin, he realized, wasn't a home. It was a machine for burning wood. That first winter, he burned through 12 cords of precious, hand-cut pine. And for all that labor, the reward was mere survival, not comfort. He swore his family would not endure another winter like that. The failure of the conventional cabin was not unique to Soren Lund. It was a universal truth of the frontier, a hardship so common it was simply accepted as part of life. The problem wasn't poor construction. Briscoe Tate was a master craftsman, and his cabins were built with tight, dovetailed corners and expert chinking. The problem was physics. A standard log cabin lost heat in 3 primary ways. The first was conduction. Heat, being energy in motion, naturally flows to cold. The thin pine logs, even at 10 inches thick, had a relatively low R value, the measure of thermal resistance. The warmth generated by the stove would physically pass through the solid wood, molecule by molecule, and escape into the frigid air outside. Laying a hand on the exterior of a log wall in winter, you could feel the escaping warmth. It was like trying to carry water in a leaky bucket. The second and more aggressive thief was convection. Cold, dense air is heavier than warm air. It would find every crack, every seam around the windows, every gap in the chinking, and push its way inside, displacing the precious warm air, which would rise and escape through similar gaps in the roof or ceiling. This created constant, imperceptible drafts. You could light a candle and watch its flame bend and dance, tracing the invisible rivers of cold air that flowed through the room. This is why families like Rufus Nyes were forced to live in a small circle around their stove. The far corners of the room were often only a few degrees warmer than the outside. The third method was radiation. Every warm object radiates heat outwards in the form of infrared energy. The warm interior walls, the stove, even the people inside, were constantly radiating their heat towards the colder exterior walls, which in turn radiated that heat into the vast, frozen emptiness of the Dakota night. Soren understood that to stay warm, he couldn't just make more heat. That was a losing battle. A battle he had fought and barely won the previous winter. He had to stop the heat from leaving. He had to build not just a shelter, but a thermal battery. And for that, he needed mass. He needed the granite fins. The construction of Lund's Folly began in late August. It was a source of constant curiosity and amusement for the settlement. Soren didn't lay a four-sided foundation. Instead, he dug 2 deep, parallel trenches for foundation stones running from the face of one granite fin to the other. These would support the front and back walls of his cabin. The massive, solid rock faces, cleaned and scraped, would serve as the east and west walls. They were already there, perfectly plumb and immovable, a gift from the landscape. He built the back wall, the one facing north, with thick 10-inch logs, carefully scribed to fit the uneven contours of the granite. He left no gaps, but he didn't stop there. Against this interior log wall, he built a second inner wall of stacked mortared stone, creating a cavity nearly a foot wide between the wood and the interior stone. This cavity he packed tightly with dry moss and sawdust, creating a thick, insulated barrier against the prevailing north wind. Briscoe Tate came to visit during this phase, his arms crossed, a look of professional pity on his face. "Soren, I'll say it again. That much stone inside is a mistake," he said, his voice echoing in the narrow space. "It has no give. It'll be cold as a tomb. That granite will leach every bit of warmth out of you. It's a heat sink. You'll freeze solid. Soren paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the massive rock face, then at the respected builder. A sink can also be a source, Briscoe, he said quietly, and returned to his work. The front wall, facing south, was different. Here, he framed a wall designed to hold two large, carefully placed windows. They were the most expensive part of the build, meticulously sealed. Rufus Nye, delivering the sash frames in his wagon, voiced his own concerns. All that glass, Soren? That's just another place for the heat to run out. And what about the damp? You're in a creek bed almost. You'll have mildew and snakes in your bedding. Soren pointed to a French drain he had already dug, a deep trench filled with gravel that ran along the base of the rock walls and channeled any moisture far away from the cabin's foundation. The damp has somewhere else to go, he explained, and the glass is not for looking out. It's for letting the sun in. The roof was the final piece of the puzzle. Instead of planking, he laid thick log rafters and covered them with a waterproof layer of birch bark scavenged from fallen trees. On top of this, he placed a foot-thick layer of prairie sod, cut in dense bricks. The grass, still alive, would form a living, insulating mat. The roof didn't just shed water, it was an integral part of the cabin's thermal envelope. Inside, instead of a great iron stove, Soren built something entirely different. In the center of the cabin, he constructed a masonry heater. It was a complex structure of brick, stone, and clay, with a winding, convoluted series of internal channels for the smoke and hot gases. It was a design he had seen German shipwrights use, a Kachelöfen. It was heavy, slow, and massive. To his neighbors, it looked like an altar to some strange god, occupying the space where a proper, efficient stove ought to be. By the time the first snows of November dusted the Black Hills, the cabin was complete. It looked less like a house and more like a part of the landscape, a hobbit hole tucked into the earth. From the north, you could barely see it. From the south, it was a simple face of wood and glass, staring out from between two stone shoulders. Thyra, his wife, had been patient and trusting, but even she had her doubts. "It is very dark, Soren," she had said, looking at the towering rock walls. "But it is solid, and there are no drafts." The mockery from the community had faded to a quiet, waiting watchfulness. The folly was built. Now all that was left was for winter to pass its judgment. To understand why Soren Lund's cabin worked, you have to understand a few basic principles of physics that were second nature to him, but utterly foreign to his neighbors. They saw stone as cold, an enemy of warmth. Soren saw it as a bank, a place to store warmth for later. The key concept is thermal mass. Different materials absorb and release heat at different rates. This property is called specific heat capacity. A material with low thermal mass, like the pine logs of a conventional cabin, heats up quickly and cools down just as fast. It can't hold on to warmth. That's why as soon as the fire died down in a regular cabin, the temperature inside would plummet. Stone, and specifically the granite of the Black Hills, is the opposite. It has a very high thermal mass. It takes a huge amount of energy to raise its temperature. A single cubic foot of granite, weighing about 168 pounds, can store vastly more heat, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, than a cubic foot of pine, which weighs only 28 pounds. Briscoe Tate was right. The stone was a heat sink. It would greedily absorb any heat it could. But Soren's design was meant to do exactly that, to intentionally and efficiently fill that sink until it overflowed. His first source of energy was the sun. This was the purpose of his large, south-facing windows. In the winter, the sun travels in a low arc across the southern sky, Soren had angled his cabin so that from mid-morning to late afternoon, direct sunlight would pour through those windows and strike the stone floor and the thick masonry of the north wall. All day long, the low, powerful winter sun would deposit its energy, free of charge, directly into the thermal mass of the cabin's interior. The stone would slowly warm up, banking thousands and thousands of BTUs. His second energy source was the masonry heater. A conventional cast iron stove is designed to get hot quickly and radiate that heat into the room. This is inefficient. A huge amount of superheated gas and potential energy escapes directly up the chimney. Soren's masonry heater was designed for the opposite. He would burn a small, very hot fire for just a couple of hours. The long, winding flue system inside the heater's massive brick and stone body was designed to extract every last bit of heat from the smoke. By the time the exhaust left the chimney, it was cool to the touch. All that heat, instead of being wasted, was absorbed into the hundreds of pounds of masonry. Soren's strategy was simple. The sun would do the bulk of the work during the day, charging the stone walls and floor. The small, efficient fire in the morning and evening would top off that charge and keep the masonry heater itself saturated with warmth. Once these massive stone elements were warm, they became a giant, gentle radiator. They didn't blast out heat like an iron stove. Instead, they released their stored energy slowly, evenly, over many hours. The entire surface of the east and west walls, the floor, and the central heater would radiate a gentle, constant warmth, keeping the air temperature stable all through the long, cold night. Furthermore, the cabin's position between the granite fins provided near-perfect shelter. The prevailing winter winds in the Dakotas came from the northwest. His cabin was completely shielded. The wind simply could not touch his north, east, or west walls. This drastically reduced the convective heat loss that plagued his neighbors' exposed cabins. Soren hadn't just built a cabin. He had built a passive, self-regulating heating system integrated directly into the landscape. That winter, the winter of 1883 to 84, arrived with a vengeance. It came in not as a gentle cooling, but as a physical assault. In mid-December, a blue norther descended on the territory. The sky turned a hard, metallic gray, and the temperature plunged. For 3 weeks, it never rose above zero. At night, it dropped to 20, then 30 degrees below. The wind was a constant, keening force that stripped away warmth with physical violence. It was a winter that would be spoken of for decades. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a siege. In Briscoe Tate's expertly crafted home, the family abandoned all rooms but the kitchen. They draped quilts over the doorways to create a smaller, defensible space around their roaring stove. The stove glowed a dull red day and night, consuming their massive woodpile at a terrifying rate. Briscoe, a man who prided himself on his foresight, started to eye the trees near his cabin with a new, desperate calculus. His windows were opaque, with a half-inch of interior frost. Rufus Nye, the wagon maker, had it worse. His cabin was older, the chinking less perfect. He ran out of seasoned hardwood in the second week of the cold snap and was reduced to burning greener pine. The wood hissed and popped, producing more smoke than heat, and the acrid smell filled the single room where his family now ate, slept, and lived. His wife, worried and exhausted, watched their children shiver under their blankets. At the boarding house, Dorothea Kell found her water pump frozen solid. Then the pipes inside the house froze, bursting with a sound like a pistol shot in the dead of night. The entire settlement was in a state of brittle, cold-soaked misery, and in the cabin tucked between the rocks, a different reality was unfolding. Soren Lund would rise in the dark, cold morning. He would load the firebox of his masonry heater with a small armful of dry wood. He would light a hot, fast fire that roared for about 2 hours. Then he would close the flue, trapping all the heat inside the masonry mass. He would do the same for 2 hours in the evening. That was it. 4 hours of fire per day. Inside Lund's Folly, the air temperature held at a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. There were no drafts. The great stone walls, which his neighbors had predicted would be his doom, were warm to the touch. Axel and Freya played on the stone floor in their shirt sleeves, their world no longer confined to a 3-foot circle around a dangerous hot stove. Thyra baked bread on the warm top of the masonry heater, the smell filling the cozy space. When the sun was out, its light streamed through the south-facing windows, and the cabin felt even warmer, storing up energy for the night ahead. They were not just surviving, they were living, comfortably and peacefully, while the world outside was locked in a battle for its life. Their woodpile, which Soren had thought might be barely adequate, seemed almost untouched. Winter stopped being a siege and became simply weather. The breaking point for the community's skepticism came during the 3rd week of the deep freeze. Rufus Nye's wife, watching her children's listless shivering and her husband's smoke-reddened eyes, finally insisted. "Go check on the Lunds," she told him. "No one has seen them. With that crazy stone house of theirs, they could be in real trouble. Go now." Rufus, dreading what he might find, pulled on his heavy coat and walked into the brutal, wind-scoured cold. The short journey to Soren's cabin felt like miles. As he approached, he saw no plume of smoke from the chimney, and a knot of fear tightened in his gut. They had run out of wood. They were frozen. He hurried to the door and knocked, his knuckles numb. When the door swung open, he was hit not by a wave of cold, but by a gentle, enveloping warmth. It was a warmth unlike the harsh, dry heat of his own stove. It was soft, radiant, and total. He stood there, speechless, staring at the scene inside. Soren Lund was sitting at a table, calmly carving a piece of wood. Thyra was knitting. The 2 children were on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. None of them were wearing coats. "Rufus," Soren said with a calm nod, "come in. It's cold out there." Rufus stumbled inside, his mind struggling to process the information his senses were giving him. He looked around the room at the bare stone walls, the lack of a roaring fire, the comfortable family. He reached out and placed his hand on the massive granite fin that formed one wall of the cabin. It wasn't cold. It was distinctly, impossibly warm. "How?" Rufus stammered, his voice hoarse. "How is this possible? My stove has been roaring for 3 weeks straight, and my windows are thick with ice. We're burning green wood just to stay alive. You have no fire." Soren gestured to the masonry heater in the center of the room. "I fed it this morning," he said simply. "Its belly is full. My stove is the rock. I just give it a little snack in the morning and at night." The news spread faster than the cold. Rufus Nye's story of the warm stone cabin was too fantastic to be believed, yet too sincere to be dismissed. The next day, Briscoe Tate came himself. He was the expert, the master framer, the loudest of the critics. His reputation was, in a small way, on the line. He walked to the cabin with a grim set to his jaw, determined to find the trick, the flaw, in the story. Soren let him in without a word. Briscoe stood in the middle of the room, turning in a slow circle. He felt the air. He looked at the sleeping children in a corner, breathing easily, their cheeks pink with warmth, not fever. He walked over to the east wall, the solid granite fin, and pressed his palm flat against it, just as Rufus had done. He closed his eyes. In that moment, all his experience, all his knowledge of board feet and tensile strength and joinery was rendered incomplete. He felt the deep stored warmth radiating from the stone. He understood. He didn't need the physics explained to him. He was a man who understood materials and he could feel the truth in the stone itself. He opened his eyes and looked at Soren Lund, who was watching him quietly. A slow nod of profound respect was his only response. After a long moment of silence, Briscoe finally spoke, his voice low with revelation. "We've been fighting the cold, Soren," he said. "All this time, we've been fighting it. You've been partnering with it. That winter, the winter that nearly broke the settlement, became the winter that reshaped it. When the cold finally released its grip in the spring, the story of Lund's Rock had become a local legend. The mockery was forgotten, replaced by a deep and quiet respect. Families came to Soren not for handouts, but for knowledge. He never lorded his success over them. He was a quiet man, motivated by the well-being of his family, not by a need for recognition. He would walk with them over their land, pointing not to the flat, easy spots, but to the south-facing slopes, the rock outcroppings, the natural windbreaks. He didn't build for them, he taught them the principles. Find the mass, he would say. Work with the sun. Hide from the wind. The change was not immediate, but it was decisive. The following year, when a new family arrived, Briscoe Tate himself advised them to build a smaller cabin dug into the side of a south-facing hill, with a massive stone hearth at its core. Rufus Nye rebuilt his own home, adding a thick stone wall to the north side. By 1886, a survey of the county noted that at least 7 new homesteads had been built, incorporating what the local paper in Deadwood called the Danish method of construction, praising its remarkable fuel efficiency and comfort. People started thinking not just about shelter, but about systems. They started to see the landscape not as a thing to be conquered, but as a collection of assets to be used. Soren Lund's intuitive design was, in reality, a century ahead of its time. What he had built in the Dakota wilderness would later be given formal names by architects and engineers. His south-facing windows and thermal mass constituted a perfect example of passive solar design. The great stone walls, absorbing the sun's heat and releasing it at night, functioned much like a trombe wall, a concept that wouldn't be patented until the 1960s. He had created, through observation and necessity, a high-efficiency, self-regulating home that modern building science would validate with complex computer models and thermal imaging. Soren Lund, the Danish shipwright, had no need for such things. He had the sun, the stone, and an understanding of how the world worked. There is a profound lesson in the story of Lund's folly. Briscoe Tate was not an ignorant man. He was a master of his craft. He knew everything there was to know about building a log cabin. His expertise, however, had become a set of blinders, preventing him from seeing a solution that lay outside his established framework. He saw stone as an enemy because, in the context of his building method, it was. The frontier, for all its harshness, was a place of radical pragmatism. It did not reward dogma or tradition for their own sakes. It rewarded what worked. Soren wasn't trying to be an innovator or a revolutionary. He was a father who couldn't bear to watch his children shiver through another winter. His solution was born of empathy and observation. He simply looked at the problem with the fresh eyes of an outsider and applied the principles he knew from a different craft. True wisdom, perhaps, is not the accumulation of a single set of skills, but the ability to see the deep, underlying physics of a problem. It's the humility to admit that the rock knows more about storing heat than you do, and the cleverness to use that knowledge to your advantage. That's how real progress happens on the frontier. Not through loud pronouncements or grand theories, but through the quiet, methodical work of a man determined to keep his family warm, who let the stone and the sun do the heating for free. If you learned something today about the power of looking at an old problem in a new way, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories of lost frontier wisdom and forgotten engineering. And I'm curious, what's the most clever use of natural materials you've ever seen or heard of? Let me know in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices and modern building science, the specific characters, names, and events depicted are fictional. The application of any building techniques, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current safety standards, building codes, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice.